Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Changing Perspectives on Human and Animal Experimentation. My name is Elizabeth Hild. I'm a professor of philosophy and the director of the Ethics Center at the Illinois Institute of Technology. I'll be moderating this seminar, and Kelly Lass will help with the questions. I'm so glad that Anita Guerrini accepted our invitation to give a presentation today. Dr. Guerrini is a historian of science and medicine. She's an emerita professor of history at Oregon State University, and she has an affiliation with the University of California at Santa Barbara. Her particular interests include the history of animals, natural history, the history of anatomy, and the uses of history in ecological restoration. She has published several books, including Experimenting with Humans and Animals. I'm really very much looking forward to Anita Guerrini's presentation. And I'd like to stress that after the presentation, we'll have time for discussion. You can either type your questions or comments in the chat while she is speaking, or afterwards you can raise your hands and unmute yourselves. But now, Anita, it's your turn. Begin with your presentation. I'm very much looking forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And what I'm going to do this morning, it's morning, Brian, is offer 4 short case studies from the second edition of my book, Experimenting with Humans and Animals from Aristotle to CRISPR, that I think illustrate the changing values surrounding animal and human experimentation. There's the cover. And then I'll offer a few conclusions and I'll open the floor to discussion. So let me begin with William Harvey. Harvey was a physician and anatomist in the first half of the 17th century. This was a period of great advances in human and animal anatomy, beginning with the publication of Vesalius's De Fabrica in 1543. Great, famous title page. Vesalius emphasized getting knowledge from dissection rather than from text, and you can see on this title page that he is the one doing the dissecting here, rather than sitting in front of the room reading from a textbook. Although Vesalius criticized his ancient predecessors for using animals to talk about human anatomy, he also did this because human bodies were difficult to obtain. This difficulty was not because there were laws against it or because the Catholic Church prohibited it. They didn't. It was because people did not want to have their loved ones dissected. Most people didn't care about animals in that way. Animals were also useful to anatomists because they could be experimented on. Vesalius devoted the last chapter of De Fabrica to the dissection of live animals. By the time Harvey attended medical school at the University of Padua in the late 1590s, Vesalius, who had been the professor of anatomy, was long gone, but his methods remained. When Harvey returned to London in 1602, he immediately set up a dissecting room in his house and began doing the research that led to the publication of his work. And he announced his discovery of the circulation of the blood in 1628. So let me read you a few paragraphs from the book. Imagine a chilly winter day in 1621. The doctor strode into the room and flung back the shutters, letting in the thin sunlight. The room was cold, but he did not notice as he moved rapidly about, setting out tools and instruments. He walked over to a stack of cages and opened the topmost one, gently pulling out a large rabbit. Its nose twitched as the doctor carefully tied it to a board with holes drilled in it, much like this board, through which he passed the thin cord. You can see some of the cords here that bound the animal's limbs. The animal lay on its back, blinking and quivering, its limbs splayed, its chest rising and falling quickly. The doctor took a sharp, thin-bladed knife and with practiced skill laid open the rabbit's chest. The animal struggled and panted, but the bonds held fast. The doctor sliced through the breastbone and spread open the ribcage with his strong fingers, exposing the rapidly beating heart. He cut a strong silk thread and tied it around the rabbit's aorta, watching with satisfaction as the animal's heart grew engorged with blood while the vessel beyond the ligature became white. He delicately sliced the aorta and saw the blood spurt out in regular pulses. As the rabbit slowly expired, the doctor seized a notebook and began to write, looking up to observe the rabbit's heart as it slowed. William Harvey repeated this and other experiments hundreds of times on dozens of different animals to prove his theory that the blood circulated through the body. Harvey was the first since the Roman Galen to initiate a research program based on experimentation on live animals. His discovery of the circulation of the blood is the most important event in the history of medicine and marks the beginning of medicine as a science. His research methods combined animal dissection and vivisection with experiments and quantitative arguments and modeled future research. During the 17th century, researchers across Europe employed Harvey's methods. Unlike Harvey, these experimenters believed that animals and human bodies were machines that could be analyzed in mechanical terms. They called themselves natural philosophers or mechanical philosophers and did not fully distinguish the biological from the physical. The term biology dates from the 19th century. The many versions of this mechanical philosophy significantly increased understanding of the body and its functions. But parallel to this mechanization of the body, and partly in reaction to it, a new sensitivity toward and awareness of animals began to evolve in this period. By proposing that the blood circulates throughout the body, Harvey advanced a theory that completely restructured his field of inquiry. He presented a new model for science that entirely changed the rules for the conduct of research. Now, anesthesia was not available at this time, so these animals were fully conscious. Harvey believed that living creatures were fundamentally different than dead ones, and that therefore he could not describe living functions with dead animals. Human and animal dissection were useful in describing anatomy, that is form, but they could give no information about physiology, that is function. Animals to Harvey served a purely instrumental function, and if the question of cruelty occurred to him, he never expressed it. A modest and appealing persona emerges in his books, but Harvey did not hesitate to dissect the body of his own father in front of an audience in his quest for knowledge. Such an act was more shocking to contemporaries than the vivisection of animals. In this era, public dissection and vivisection flourished alongside many forms of public entertainment based on animal performance. Dancing bears, bears fighting with dogs, cockfighting, and all manner of cat torture were commonplace, and everyday cruelty to animals was the rule rather than the exception. Pet keeping was still uncommon, although Harvey described his wife's pet parrot, whose death she grieved. Her feeling for the bird, however, did not prevent her spouse from dissecting it. So my next case study is from the 18th century and is about experimenting on humans. And here I talk about inoculation and later vaccination for smallpox. And this is a poster from the World Health Organization from the early 1960s promoting smallpox vaccination. Smallpox, by the way, is the only infectious disease that has been officially eliminated from the world. It was declared eliminated in 1980. Now, there's some confusion about the terms inoculation and vaccination. Now we use the word vaccination to denote any kind of injected immunization for a disease. But its original usage in the late 18th century, as we'll see, was quite specific. So let's begin with a bit on what smallpox was. Excuse me. Although in this age before antibiotics, many infectious diseases were endemic, smallpox was an especially omnipresent affliction. The virus that caused it could travel through the air, making it highly contagious. And one might contract the disease simply by being in the same room with a smallpox sufferer. Its course included a high fever, upper respiratory symptoms, and finally the characteristic pox or rash. Each stage of the disease carried its own dangers, but the pox were the most dangerous and the most feared. Discrete pox, that is individual, were better than confluent ones that ran together. But in either case, the pox could attack the eyes as well as the inside of the mouth and throat. What we now recognize as different strains of the smallpox virus could cause more or less severe symptoms. How smallpox, and particularly the more virulent variola major, reached Europe is uncertain. But by the 16th century, it had become established as one of the more serious of the many hurdles children faced in their struggle to reach adulthood. Adulthood did not in any case offer safety. The pockmarked faces and bodies of many adults and the blindness of others gave evidence of that struggle. Some did not survive the disease. In an average year, about 20% of all those infected died, which is a very high percentage. In years of epidemic, a larger percentage perished. Prevailing medical theories offered the smallpox victim conflicting advice. While the disease was obviously contagious, no one knew exactly how that worked. Especially in its early stages, smallpox was difficult to distinguish from other rash-producing diseases such as measles. Surviving an attack was believed to confer immunity, but no one knew how or why this occurred, or how long it lasted. The French King Louis XV had been diagnosed with a mild case of smallpox in 1728 and was thus thought to be immune. When he became ill in 1774, smallpox was not suspected until far too late, and Louis died miserably. But what in any case could his doctors have done? And we now know that smallpox immunity probably lasts about 20 years. Most agreed that those who had once had smallpox did not usually get it again. Some parents would allow their unaffected children to catch the disease from their siblings, and in rural areas, children were often urged to get in bed with relatives suffering from smallpox. So-called buying the pox was also common. Parents would send their children to the home of a victim of a mild attack to purchase a few of the scabs. African slaves reported similar practices in their homelands of deliberately inducing the disease to confer immunity. But no one understood how the disease was contracted or how immunity was conferred, or indeed what immunity was. Reports from outside Europe of inoculation, of deliberately inducing smallpox to confer immunity, appeared at the Royal Society of London, the most famous scientific society in Europe. In 1700, a physician described to the society the Chinese practice of inhaling dried smallpox matter to induce the disease. In 1714 and 1716, accounts appeared in the Society's philosophical transactions of the Turkish method of inoculation, in which matter from smallpox sores was inserted into small cuts in the skin, usually in the arm. This resembled African practices and was widespread in the Middle East. European physicians were reluctant to adopt inoculation, even though it was apparently successful. Its folk origins made it suspect, and physicians were notoriously conservative in their therapies. What physician who valued his reputation would deliberately induce a disease? The general sentiment was that inoculation was experimental in every sense of the term, and no physician wished to be the first to perform the experiment on his patients. This is Lady Mary Wortley Montague, who was instrumental in introducing smallpox inoculation to Britain. She had suffered from smallpox herself. If she had been a famous beauty and she felt that it ruined her looks, she lost her eyebrows and eyelashes, among other things. And so she was a big promoter of smallpox inoculation. And she was the wife of the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire in the 17-teens. So she described inoculation in Turkey in 1717, and this is a very long quotation, so I'm putting it up here so you can read it along if you want to. This is from a letter she wrote to a friend. The smallpox, so fatal and so general amongst us here, is entirely harmless by the invention of engrafting, which is the term they give it. There is a set of old women who make it their business to perform the operation. Every autumn in the month of September, when the great heat is abated, people send to one another to know if any of their family has a mind to have the smallpox. They make parties for this purpose, and when they are met, commonly 15 or 16 together, the old woman comes with a nutshell full of the matter of the best sort of smallpox and asks what veins you please to have opened. she immediately rips open that you offer to her with a large needle, which gives you no more pain than a common scratch, and puts into the vein as much venom as can lie upon the head of her needle, and after binds up the little wound with a hollow bit of shell, and in this manner opens up 4 or 5 veins. The children or young patients play together all the rest of the day and are in perfect health until the 8th, that is the 8th day after the inoculation. Then the fever begins to seize them, and they keep in their beds 2 days, very seldom 3. They rarely have above 20 or 30 in their faces, that is pockmarks, which never mark. And in 8 days' time, they are as well as before their illness. Every year, thousands undergo this operation, and the French ambassador says pleasantly that they take the smallpox here by way of diversion, as they take the waters in other countries. Now, inoculation became very popular among the British aristocracy and then among more general population, and it spread through Europe from the 1730s onwards. Yet many questions remained unanswered. How did inoculation work? Why did some of those inoculated get mild cases of smallpox and others severe ones? How long did this induced immunity last? Couldn't inoculated victims spread the disease as easily as readily as natural cases? They could, and they did. Could physicians justify causing disease for whatever reason? Now, the ultimate success of inoculation was based on statistical evidence, one of the first uses of this technique. James Germ was the secretary of the Royal Society in the 1720s. He surveyed the effectiveness of inoculation by comparing the numbers of deaths caused by inoculation to those caused by naturally induced smallpox. Gathering case histories from a wide range of practitioners over a period of several years, Germ collated this evidence and provided convincing proof that the mortality rate from natural smallpox far exceeded that from the inoculated version. Germ analyzed London over a 20-year period and showed that the risk of dying from natural smallpox was about 1 in every 8 cases. In times of epidemic, this could be 1 in 5 or 6. In contrast, 1 in 60 had died among inoculated cases in New England, and Germ arrived at a similar figure for the period of 1721 to 1727 in England itself. Germ's numerical arguments, based on the emerging science of probability, convinced those who sought answers in scientific authority. By the end of the 18th century, inoculation was widespread in Europe, and itinerant inoculators inoculated thousands of people. Inoculation was risky. You could get smallpox and you could die. But taking one's chances with natural smallpox was far riskier. The mathematics of probability that Germ used was first developed in the 17th century to analyze games of chance, to predict who would win a bet. Inoculation was surely the biggest gamble of the 18th century, and it remained essentially an experiment since no one knew how it worked or why. So let's fast forward 70 years and we turn from inoculation to vaccination. Okay, this is Edward Jenner. Dairymen and milkmaids had long known that if they contracted a bovine disease known as cowpox, they were very unlikely to contract smallpox. If a milkmaid had a small cut on her hand, she could easily contract the disease when she milked an infected cow, because often the teats of the cow would get the sores. Cowpox was usually a mild disease in humans, manifesting itself in a few pustules, often on the hands and arms, and about a week of feeling unwell. Edward Jenner was an experienced inoculator, and he was interested in cowpox and its causes and the interrelations among cows, humans, and horses, since horsepox was also related to cowpox. During the 1780s and 90s, Jenner collected case histories of patients who had contracted cowpox in the past and who then were found to be resistant to smallpox, either natural or inoculated. He documented 23 cases in his 1798 book, The Inquiry into the Causes and Effects of the Variolae Vicinae. Case 17 narrates Jenner's first vaccination. So this is from Vicinia, which is cowpox, variola vicinia, via the Latin word for cow, which is vacca. So vaccination then was a very specific thing at this point. On the 14th of May, 1796, Jenner inoculated an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps, using material he had taken from the arm of Sarah Nelms, a milkmaid who was infected with what Jenner believed to be cowpox. James received the cowpox matter in his arm in the same way others were inoculated with smallpox. In other words, you made a scratch, you put the matter of the sore in it and bound it up. James felt some discomfort over the course of the next 10 days, but he recovered. In July 1796, Jenner variolated him. That is, he inoculated James with smallpox or variola. And he had variolated James in both arms, and nothing happened. James did not get smallpox. Jenner repeated this several months later and several more times over the next few years. While Jenner's experiment appears to have been successful, these repeated variolations may also have built up James's immunity to smallpox. But we now know that Jenner was essentially correct, that cowpox could give immunity to smallpox, although neither he nor his contemporaries understood why. A full understanding of the action of vaccines in inducing immunity took over a century to develop, following from Pasteur's work in the 1880s. And this is my all-time favorite cartoon from this era. This is a great era of political and social cartoons. You can see Jenner in the middle here. And everyone is getting, this is the puck of the cow in this bucket, and he's inoculating people who then immediately have cows protruding from various parts of their anatomy. And the really kind of pièce de résistance is the golden calf in the background from the Bible. Okay. So now we turn to Pasteur, the germ theory, and vaccines for other diseases. In 1878, a Frenchman coined the word microbe to denote a microscopic infectious agent. Microbes soon encompassed a great variety of organisms, including bacteria, protozoa, and fungi, each of which caused infection in different ways. Other infectious agents for diseases such as smallpox and rabies could not be found and were presumed to be too small to be viewed under conventional optical microscopes. These agents are viruses, which are much smaller than other disease-causing entities. The adoption by scientists and physicians of the germ theory of disease, which stated that contagious diseases were caused by the action of microbes, opened new arenas for research that promised immediate human benefit. Dozens of scientists contributed to these developments, but two men were largely responsible for the development of the germ theory of disease in the 1870s and its subsequent public acceptance: the French chemist Louis Pasteur and the German physician Robert Koch. Employing thousands of animals and a few human subjects, they developed the theories and techniques that confirmed the germ theory. In 1850, two Frenchmen had noticed a broad-shaped microbe in the blood of anthrax victims. A decade later, one of these, Casimir Joseph Davin, injected sheep's blood that he believed to be infected with anthrax microbes into rabbits, which soon died. Others pointed out that the rabbits may not have died from anthrax. Cow's blood with no trace of the microbe was equally fatal, which is true. In 1877, as Pasteur began work on anthrax, a rural German physician named Robert Koch grew the anthrax bacteria outside of the body using the aqueous humor of an ox's eye as the medium. Under the microscope, he could see the characteristic rods grow and multiply. So it's kind of a combination of things here. In other words, there's a kind of the in vitro cultivation of the germ, there is a use of the microscope, and Koch also developed several techniques of dyeing the cells so they would show up better under the microscope. In 1877, Pasteur and Koch each published on the causes of anthrax. And anthrax, by the way, is also one of the biggest disease-causing bacteria, so it's kind of the easiest to discover. Koch detailed his techniques, which involved animals at several steps, particularly in testing whether a particular microbe caused a particular disease. In developing vaccines for anthrax, chicken cholera, and swine fever between 1878 and 1883, Pasteur followed Koch's techniques with great success. In each of these cases, Pasteur developed a vaccine by weakening the virulence of the microbe, whether by heat, chemicals, or prolonged exposure to the air. The principle of a vaccine, he believed, must follow the model of Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccine. A weaker variety of the disease could provoke immunity. He cultivated the microbe in a sterile medium, in this case, probably agar-agar gelatin, which was not the aqueous humor pronounceae. But in these studies, Pasteur and his assistant, the physician Emile Loup, discovered that the virulence of a microbe could also be altered, either increased or decreased, by passing it through living animal bodies. Pasteur passed weakened cultures of chicken cholera through a series of chickens to increase its virulence. He gradually came to realize that the microbe itself had changed by this passage through a number of chickens, and this is what's now called mutation. Pasteur and Roux began their quest for a rabies vaccine in 1880. Pasteur could not find the rabies microbe since, as a virus, it remained invisible with his optical microscope. But he remained convinced that the cause of rabies was a microbe, and that the techniques he had used to develop vaccines for other animal diseases would also be effective with rabies. Pasteur at first believed that immunity could only be conveyed by a living but weakened microbe, which would consume the nutritional supplies of the host organism and leave nothing for the more virulent microbes that followed. Later, he concluded that the microbe released a chemical toxin and that immunization was therefore a chemical process. This shifting understanding reminds us of the immense uncertainty surrounding microbes and their actions in this period, as well as the vast differences among microbes because they didn't all act the same way. Pasteur thought he understood what caused immunity, but he did not know how the body could produce immunity. While today, the phrase germs cause diseases seems too obvious to need explanation, 140 years ago, every word in that phrase was questionable. What was a germ? What was disease? How was disease caused? Building on their previous experience, Pasteur and Roux employed animal bodies rather than sterile gelatin in their quest for a rabies vaccine, and they mainly employed rabbits. Pasteur's decision to use animals as his test tubes had momentous consequences for the future use of animals in research. Thereafter, bacteriological and immunological research became inextricably linked to the use of animals as culture media. As the scale of research grew, so too did the numbers of animals. Pasteur used hundreds of animals to develop the rabies vaccine. Between 1882 and 1885, for example, he passed the virus through 90 sets of rabbits. Paul Ehrlich, 20 years later, used thousands of mice to develop his anti-syphilis medication, Selversan. The development of the polio vaccine in the 1950s required the sacrifice, as we'll see, of millions of monkeys. Now, the story of the boy Joseph Meister and Pasteur's dramatic success with this rabies vaccine in the summer of 1885 is well known. Less well known is that Pasteur was not at all certain that the vaccine would work. Previous tests on both humans and dogs were still inconclusive, according to his notebooks, which were studied by Jerry Wiesen about 20 years ago. Here's a slide. Was Pasteur's treatment of Joseph therefore unethical? By modern standards, absolutely. To perform human trials without adequate demonstration on animals is a violation of modern clinical and experimental ethics. And if Pasteur were in a modern laboratory answerable to institutional ethics committees, he would not have been allowed to go through with his treatment. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the story of Joseph Meister, very quickly, he was a boy who had been bitten by what everyone was sure was a rabid dog. He was brought to Pasteur in Paris, said, please, please, please give him your experimental rabies vaccine. And Pasteur agreed to do this, even though, as I just said, he wasn't really sure that it was going to work. But he did. So even his assistant, Pasteur's assistant, Emile Roux, believed that Pasteur had inadequate animal evidence on which to base his conclusions. On the other hand, Joseph Meister seemed to face certain death. We now know that not everyone exposed to rabies develops the disease, but at the time, opinion was unanimous that the boy would die without treatment. In addition, neither Joseph nor his mother, who brought him to Pasteur, could be said to have been adequately informed by modern standards of the possible results of their treatment. In other words, they trusted Pasteur absolutely. The ethical dilemma of Joseph Meister's case presents on several levels. Did Pasteur believe he was acting ethically, or was he motivated by ambition? Are these motives mutually exclusive? Was Roux correct to assert that no human trials were possible, given the current state of knowledge? Can we apply modern ethical standards to activities in the past? With present restrictions on research, could Pasteur have made his discoveries today? These questions are not easily resolved. So now I turn to my final case study, which is polio. So polio prevention before the vaccine, this picture is probably from the mid to late 1940s. And these are the things you could do to avoid getting polio. Don't play with strangers, don't get too tired, scrub your hands, obey your doctor, don't get chilled, which is an interesting one. But the idea was that if you played too hard, if you swam too much in the summer, you could somehow contract polio. No one really understood how this happened. Polio, like smallpox, has disappeared so completely from most of the world that its absence seems normal. The last recorded case of naturally occurring polio in the Western Hemisphere was in Peru in 1991. And I'm sure somebody will have a question about the recent case in New York State, and I'll be happy to talk about that in the question. Along with hundreds of thousands of other children, I was injected with the Salk vaccine in the late 1950s. And a few years later, I lined up at school to get a dose of the same oral vaccine out of a little paper cup. It was on a sugar cube. The conquest of polio is one of the great triumphs of modern medical science. In the United States, the number of new cases of polio dropped from 20,000 per year in the early 1950s, 58,000 in the epidemic year of 1952, to 5,000 in 1960, to virtually none a decade later. In 1988, the World Health Organization set as its goal the certification of the world as polio-free by 2005. But war, political and social unrest, and uneven funding have meant that parts of the world retain pockets of polio. Polio cases overall, however, have declined by 99% since 1988. Smallpox, however, remains the only infectious disease to be declared fully eradicated. At least 1 million monkeys, and possibly up to 5 times that number, were sacrificed to develop the Salk and Sabin vaccines. In the light of new research about primate consciousness, intelligence, and sensibility, their use as experimental tools can no longer be taken for granted. In addition, the procedures followed in the early human trials of the Salk vaccine in the early 1950s raised questions about informed consent, human experimentation, and statistical design. The viral disease poliomyelitis, in its most severe form, attacks the lining of the spinal cord and causes paralysis. Although paralytic polio, even at its height, was an uncommon disease, its incidence among school-aged children made it seem much more common than it actually was. According to the severity of the attack, as well as measures taken during the attack, the paralysis can be temporary or permanent. It can affect one or more limbs with varying severity, and it can even paralyze the muscles of the chest and diaphragm, preventing breathing and swallowing. And this is yes, and these are the iron lungs here that were used for polio victims whose diaphragms were paralyzed, and it was like a pressure chamber that would actually use air pressure to allow you to breathe. It would push on your chest to allow you to breathe. Some people would be in this for months or years. There are a few people who are in iron lungs for the remainder of their lives. Polio can be deadly, but most patients recover, although some have permanent disabilities. In addition, post-polio syndrome can sometimes affect polio survivors years after their initial illness with muscle weakness and joint degeneration. Flaring to epidemic intensity around the world, its appearances in the 20th century focused on the United States. In the 1952 epidemic, 3,000 deaths occurred among 58,000 cases. The potential of lifetime disability with its attendant social costs, made polio a much feared disease. While it most often struck children, thus its alternative label of infantile paralysis, it could also affect adults. The New York politician Franklin Roosevelt was 39 when he contracted polio in 1921. And his election as president of the United States 11 years later gave powerful impetus to polio research. Franklin Roosevelt's polio helped to change the image of polio from a childhood disease to one that could strike anyone at any time. Roosevelt's political prominence, personal charisma, and numerous connections made polio research a national priority. The National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, founded with Roosevelt's sponsorship in 1937, established the March of Dimes fundraising campaigns, which raised millions of dollars for polio treatment and research. And this is one of the posters from the 1940s for the March of Dimes. And I can remember my mother going door to door collecting dimes, literally, for the March of Dimes in the 1950s. It had been established earlier in the century that polio only attacked primates and only attacked the nervous system. These are both not entirely true, but it led to the first widespread use of primates in research, in this case, mostly rhesus macaque monkeys, but also chimpanzees and other monkeys. Researchers used thousands of monkeys in polio research beginning in the early 1900s. Until the 1930s, virologists could not grow viruses outside a living medium. Therefore, monkeys became test tubes, growing the virus in their spines, and researchers killed the monkeys, ground up their spines, and repeated the process. The population of rhesus macaques in their native India plummeted from an estimated 5 to 10 million in the 1930s to fewer than 200,000 by the late 1970s. Polio research, especially after World War II, contributed to this decimation. And the United States imported 200,000 rhesus macaques a year in the 1950s for vaccine production and research because the vaccine was produced in monkeys. India began to restrict their exportation in 1955. The development of tissue culture techniques in the 1930s lessened researchers' reliance on animals, although it did not eliminate it. In the mid-1930s, researchers grew the polio virus in a test tube using human embryonic tissue. But this was hard to obtain and controversial because it was obtained from stillbirths and miscarriages. Another researcher, John Enders, later used tissue from the foreskins of circumcised baby boys, and this was somewhat more acceptable because it would just have been discarded in any case. Public pressure to develop a vaccine was enormous. Hard for us to recognize how afraid parents were of polio. Two researchers in the mid-1930s independently developed vaccines. Maurice Brody developed a killed virus vaccine, and John Colmer a live but weakened virus. Both proceeded quickly to human trials on children. Brody vaccinated several thousand children, but several came down with allergic reactions, and it was unclear if the vaccine worked. This was the killed virus one. Colmer, with the live virus vaccine, was even more ambitious, vaccinating some 10,000 children. But several of them developed polio, and a few died. It was not clear what kind of consent they obtained from the children's parents, since there were no regulations at all for this kind of testing. Colmer especially was reprimanded by the American Public Health Association in 1935, and both Colmer and Brody abandoned polio research. Several laboratories after World War II worked on developing a polio vaccine. Isabel Morgan at Johns Hopkins showed success with a killed virus vaccine in chimpanzees in 1948. But she left vaccine research in 1949 after she married. Researchers began testing vaccines on institutionalized children, institutionalized for any number of reasons, cognitive disability, physical disability, etc. And this was something that was very commonly done in this period. So polio vaccines began to be tested on institutionalized children around 1950. And this was one reason, apart from her marriage, one reason Morgan left polio research is that she was unwilling to do this. She was unwilling to test her vaccines on institutionalized children. Jonas Salk at the University of Pittsburgh was the first to develop a killed virus vaccine that appeared to be effective on monkeys in the early 1950s, and he proceeded to human trials in 1952. First on himself and his lab workers, also extremely common, and then on his family, and then on institutionalized children. In 1954, the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, the association that was founded by Roosevelt, who funded Salk's research, organized a national field trial. 1.6 million children in first, second, and third grades participated as polio pioneers. Thomas Francis, Salk's mentor, who had developed the first flu vaccine in the early 1940s, was in charge of this field trial. He organized a double-blind trial of 600,000 children, in which some would receive the vaccine and others a placebo, a very new technique. Now, one thing about this vaccine, because it was a killed virus vaccine, it could not give you polio. The question was whether it could provide enough immunity. Side by side with the double-blind test in 11 states was an observed control test in 33 states, in which the control group was not given a placebo, but merely observed. While the randomized placebo model was essential to eliminate the effects of bias on the results and would help to placate Salk's critics, in his words, it would make the humanitarian shudder. However, non-paralytic polio looked a lot like some other flu-like diseases, and a doctor could diagnose a vaccinated patient wrongly. The observed control trials were far easier to sell to nervous parents, who disliked not knowing whether their child had received the vaccine. The fear of polio was so great that parents overwhelmingly agreed that their children should be polio pioneers and participate in the field trials. The consent forms they filled out did not employ the word consent. Over 60% of parents requested that their children participate in the placebo trials, and almost 70% in the observed control trials. Extensive publicity and in-school presentations encouraged parents to understand the benefits of what was about to occur. Now we should point out, again, at this point, that monkeys were used to make the vaccine. Vaccine production at the time of the trials claimed 4,000 monkeys a month. In April 1955, the results of the trial were announced. Salk's vaccine was 80 to 90% effective, and it was immediately licensed and rushed into production. Meanwhile, others, including Albert Sabin, began conducting trials of his live virus, that's live but weakened virus vaccines, first among US prisoners, another very common group used for all kinds of testing, and later in Russia. Sabin's vaccine was licensed in 1961 and soon supplanted the Salk vaccine. We can talk more about the differences between these two in the questions if you like, and this is relevant to the current case in New York State, which is a vaccine-induced infection, although the person who got infected did not actually get the vaccine. So, okay. The polio pioneers would not have been allowed under current guidelines for human subjects, and it was questionable even in 1954. One physician told me the fact that it worked gave it a lot of cover. And this is an example of the publicity for the polio vaccine when Elvis very publicly received the vaccine in 1956. So to conclude briefly, what can we learn from these case studies? Meaningful regulation of both animal and human experimentation did not take place in the US until the 1970s and 80s. IRB's Institutional Review Board for Human Subject Research were established under the National Research Act of 1974. Institutional Animal Care and Use Committees, or IACUCs, were established under the 1985 revision of the 1966 Animal Welfare Act. Neither of these are flawless, but they afford much more protection for research subjects than previously existed. One question we can discuss is, can a research project follow all the rules and still be unethical? IRBs and IACUCs have no formal ethical requirement. They are simply rules an institution must follow. And genetic engineering adds kind of another layer of ethical and, I have to say, scientific conundrums to this issue. As you can see from these case studies, opinions have certainly changed on what constitutes responsible research. And this suggests that even now, we do not have all the answers. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you for this fascinating presentation that spanned several centuries. Thank you very much. So everyone, please type your questions or raise your hands, and so that we can have a discussion about the presentation. Maybe I begin with a question that built up in me while you were talking, which is, I mean, I understand that the polio research had to, I mean, that this was something that was about children in a central way. But what I found striking is that the painting you showed with Edward Jenner, that this was about a child, and also
Yes.
with Louis Pasteur. I mean, this again was a child. And I understand that there may have been the need to, the feeling that there's pressure to help them or something, but from our perspective, right, to our today's perspective, I mean, these were minors, they were not capable of giving their consent. So this was somehow strange to us, and also that their names were really known. I mean, you had in both cases, you really had their names. And even a painting kind of showing, yeah, this was this was a great improvement. Don't get me wrong, but I just found this striking.
Well, I think in the case of James Phipps, he was kind of in the right place at the right time, but also, yeah, because he was a child, he could not consent, although I guess his mother did, but another person that Jenner experimented on was a boy who was in a workhouse, who was an orphan, who could not really consent. And it was just like, okay, let's try this kid. And there was a lot of that, because one of the ways that smallpox vaccine was transported by a Spanish physician in the early 19th century was to take a bunch of orphan boys who had been vaccinated, and then they would be the source of the vaccine. Basically, you would then draw their blood and use it to vaccinate other people. So it was totally the most powerless of people. Definitely. In the case of Joseph Meister, that's why he was the first one to be the test subject. I think partly, again, he presented himself, but also Pasteur was not immune to fame and publicity, and this was a big deal. There were people waiting outside his laboratory after Joseph Meister had been injected, and after, several weeks, and it was announced, kind of like in 1955, yes, this works. No, he didn't get rabies. And it was, this national thing. I mean, every little village in France has a Rue Pasteur. Honestly, he was the most famous man in France after 1885. So I think there is a lot of mixed motives in that. I mean, with polio, it's a little more straightforward in that it was thought to be primarily a childhood disease. But rabies certainly was not. Smallpox certainly was not. So yeah, I think part of it is definitely the children are powerless, relatively speaking.
Yeah. Also that their names are known. I was thinking of Louis Brown, the first IVF.
Yes.
That's a similar case, and it's pretty late. It's in the 1970s, isn't it? And I'm not sure whether
1978, yeah.
we would think that this is a good idea at all to kind of have this person with his name being the research beneficiary, research subject, whatever you want to put in there. I mean, this is very interesting.
But I mean, in Pasteur's publication on the polio, the small rabies vaccine, he names Joseph Meister. He's named in the scientific article. So it wasn't just an anonymous person, because everyone in France knew who Joseph Meister was. And Joseph Meister ended up being a guard at the Pasteur Institute later in life. So there's this kind of circular thing going on there too.
I see we have a question. Everyone else, please type your questions or raise your hands. I just read it. Nikila Panyam writes, this raises the question of consent. Oh yeah, for those souls which cannot speak or communicate to humans using words. I mean, this could be about animals or about, yet their different actions to avoid the testing should be considered. Behavioral cues.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and certainly, what happened here? Certainly the case with using institutionalized children for the polio vaccine tests, they, in many cases, were severely cognitively disabled and definitely could not answer for themselves. Often their parents were not there, and so it was the institution itself that consented to their being used as experimental subjects. And this, you can't do that anymore, but you could do that in the 50s. And so, yeah, so definitely, and in the case of animals, obviously, they do not have representation or the ability to speak for themselves, absolutely.
Other questions, comments? I have more questions, but I don't want to be the one who dominates this with all my questions. So,
and feel free to raise your hands as well. If you'd like, we can also just enable you to talk if you just raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question directly.
If anyone wants to ask me about the case of polio in New York State,
yeah, that's another thing to
about that.
mention this. You mentioned, maybe you can talk about this.
So yeah, so the person who got polio in New York State a couple months ago now was not vaccinated, and the strain of polio he got is a strain that is only now in there are 3 strains of polio. One strain has been declared eradicated by the use of vaccines. The Salk vaccine is used mostly in the United States. The Salk vaccine has been brought back from around the year 2000 because the Sabin vaccine, which is a live virus vaccine, carries a very small chance of transmitting polio. So once polio was eliminated in the United States, in the Western Hemisphere in the 1990s, it was determined that it was safer to use the killed virus vaccine, which had no chance of giving someone polio, even though the coverage of the Sabin vaccine is somewhat better because it gives better immunity because it gives immunity through the gut, which is actually where polio develops. So later, but the Sabin vaccine, the live polio vaccines, continue to be used in the rest of the world. It's much easier to administer because it's oral rather than injected. It's easier to keep, and it gives better immunity. So formulations of that vaccine after about, I can't remember, maybe 2016, didn't include the strain that was declared to be eliminated. However, this person was infected by that strain, which means he caught it from someone who had been vaccinated at some point in the past. or that this was somehow transmitted through people who had been vaccinated with oral polio vaccine, but not in the past 5 years. So it's kind of complicated because he got this strain, which is a vaccine transmitted strain, which means it hasn't been eliminated, but it means that someone was carrying this strain who had been vaccinated, and that conveyed that to this person who had been traveling in an area where polio was still around. So when you hear that this was a vaccine induced illness, it's not, he didn't get sick because he was vaccinated. He got sick because he wasn't vaccinated. If he had been vaccinated, exposure to this strain of polio would not have given him polio. So that, and where he lives in Rockland County, New York, is has a big Hasidic community, which are very anti-vax in many ways. So the vaccination rate in that county is something like 68% for polio, which is very low. So there's all these factors that come into the fact that this person was infected with polio, and it was indeed a vaccine-induced strain, but it wasn't because he was vaccinated, which is really hard to explain because there's all these kind of steps involved.
Yeah, thank you for explaining this. Yeah, this is really complicated. I heard it on the news, but obviously I didn't understand the context.
Well, and I think most people think, aha, see, he got it from a vaccine, therefore we shouldn't vaccinate people for polio, but that's not true. We should vaccinate people for polio. And I think many Americans think, well, polio isn't around anymore, so why bother? But it is around. It's around in other parts of the world. It's not like smallpox, where nobody's been vaccinated for smallpox in the United States, I think, since the 70s. Although monkeypox now is another thing, and people who are vaccinated against smallpox still have some protection against monkeypox. Although, I mean, I was vaccinated against smallpox when I was like 4, so I don't think I have a whole lot of protection left. But the vaccine for monkeypox is basically a modified smallpox vaccine. So it's, yeah, there's kind of layers and layers in these things.
I have another question that refers to the beginning of your presentation when you talked about William Harvey and the blood circulation experiments on animals. And you talked about the function form distinction. You do this a lot. And I was wondering, what is the role of Descartes in all of this? And the mind-body distinction, body and soul. What is this? I'm just curious, how does this play out? Does this play a role at this point or not yet?
Not on Harvey. Harvey and Descartes were more or less contemporaries. Descartes was a little younger, and Harvey never was mechanist in the way that Descartes was. Descartes said the body is a machine, and he thought the circulation was legitimate, but he had a very different explanation for it. And no, I mean, Harvey didn't think animals didn't feel pain. He thought they did, but he thought it was justified to inflict pain for the sake of science, which many of his contemporaries also believed, that it was just that. And I don't know if he kind of thought through to the idea that animals don't have souls or anything like that. He never talks about anything like that. So he was not influenced by Descartes. Descartes was definitely influenced by Harvey. Harvey publishes his work on the circulation in 1628. At that point, Descartes is still quite young. He's in his 20s, and he's, anyway, early 30s. But he reads this, and suddenly it's like, oh, wow, yes, okay. And this is mechanical, or can be interpreted as a very mechanical explanation of how the body works, that the body is basically this pumping circulatory system. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. We have 2 more questions. So do you know if any animals have been used to develop the COVID vaccine?
Oh, yes. I wrote a whole article on that. Yeah, I wrote an article in the journal Endeavor. I think it's open access too, on animals and the COVID vaccine. It came out last year. Yeah, a lot of animals. And all kinds of animals. Mostly, again, you know, rabbits and such, monkeys, cats, because it's not all animals get COVID, but some animals do, and some animals get it more severely than other animals. Cats actually get it pretty severely, so cats have been used quite a lot to develop a vaccine. Yeah, a lot of animals were used in the development of the COVID vaccine, definitely.
Yeah, I was thinking of the COVID vaccine too, when you had this Elvis picture with this public. Yeah. There's another question. It says it is widely known that chimpanzees have been used for testing HIV and AIDS, especially in places like the Langone Medical Center in New York. Those chimpanzees have now been relocated to sanctuaries. Have ethics changed with medical research in animals?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, the whole policy for the use of primates, and NIH policy from 2015 on, they have not used chimpanzees in NIH-funded research. And the chimpanzees that have been on site in Bethesda at NIH have been phased out of research. I don't think there are any now being used for disease research. I'm not sure about behavioral research, but certainly any NIH-funded research, the chimpanzees are no longer used, which is a big change.
Yeah, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Our time is up, and at least students at IIT will have to go to their classes. This is our lunch time.
Yeah. Well, feel free to email me.
Yeah.
If you have any other questions.
Yeah, any other questions? So now that we are at the end, I'd really like to thank Anita for your presentation. I learned a lot from this historical perspective on human and animal experiments. Thanks a lot, everyone, for attending, and thank you for those questions. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a good afternoon and rest of the day.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all for your questions. I appreciate it.